There were several highlights and a few lowlights that we want to address in this week's legislative press availability. And we'll start with some of the highlights. Over the last several years, our caucus has been pushing for a variety of things that we believe would make Oklahoma a better place. And this week saw several legislative successes in those areas. For example, we've said for the last number of years that we believe criminal justice reform had to be a major priority. And thankfully this week, in a bipartisan effort with Representative Pam Peterson and the Speaker of the House, we saw several criminal justice reform measures pass off with overwhelming bipartisan support and are sent over to the Senate, hopefully for their quick approval. So that was a highlight that we've been pushing for a number of years and have finally seen some success this week. Also, when it comes to equal pay for equal work, Representative Jason Dunnington and Representative Emily Virgin from Norman have been trying to ensure that the women in Oklahoma's workforce get paid just as much as the man doing the same job that she is. And while we had some challenges getting that bill through the process, thankfully this week that Representative Dunnington and Representative Virgin had the equal pay bill pass off the House floor and was sent over to the Senate. We hope that the Senate will see it as an important issue, just as the House did. We'll pass it, send it back to us so that we can hopefully amend it however they wish to do so we can get that bill onto the governor, and women in Oklahoma can look forward to being paid exactly what their male counterparts get paid. Another issue that was important to us was civil asset forfeiture reform. That was a big debate that Senator Lovelace started over the interim. While his legislation was significantly more controversial, Representative Corey Williams from Stillwater in our caucus had another solution to try to address that problem, in which it said that if a local law enforcement agency were to seize an individual's assets, if an individual had the right to go back and petition the law enforcement agency to return those assets to them, when that happened, the law enforcement agency had to pay for the attorney fees for that citizen, because we believe if the citizen's assets were wrongfully acquired, they shouldn't have to pay to get them back. That was what Representative Williams believed, and thankfully an overwhelming number of the House members believe the same thing. Another important, hugely important issue resides in the area of autism insurance reform for children with autism. 8 years ago, Representative Mike Brown from Tahlequah was the initial champion of that issue, recognizing that it was a travesty in Oklahoma for families to pay for health insurance for themselves and for their children, but as soon as their child was diagnosed with autism, the insurance company would then refuse to give them the care that they needed. So Representative Brown 8 years ago introduced what was then known as Nick's Law, hoping to require insurance companies to cover those children with autism. Unfortunately, the Republican majority for a number of years defeated that bill year after year after year, defeated it as an amendment year after year after year. But now that the rest of the country is on board, I think 43 states have seen the importance of autism insurance reform. Finally, Oklahoma House Republicans have agreed that it's time to move forward with that issue. And to his credit, Representative Jason Nelson, working with Representative Mike Brown and a variety of other representatives in a bipartisan manner, have put together an autism reform package that passed out this week, and we hope the Senate will see the importance of it and pass it out as well. Although we will note for those families at home who are very concerned about that issue and hoping that it passes, the word now is that there are several Senate Republicans who are not as supportive of the issue. In particular, maybe one Senate chairman who may do all he can to prevent the bill from becoming heard in the Senate committee or on the Senate floor. We hope that the people back home will put enough pressure on their senators and encourage them to hear that bill. Another important reform from Representative Claudia Griffith from Norman. Her legislation this week would open up Insure Oklahoma, which is a great program, insurance program for small businesses in the state. It would open up Insure Oklahoma to be able to be used by part-time employees as well. And so we were proud of Representative Griffith for getting that done. A couple of the issues, another one of the issues as it pertains to education is we have called for an end to EOI exams in Oklahoma, or what they call otherwise known as end of instruction exams. They're exams that our children our high school students had to take in order to complete a history class or a math class at the end of the year, but none of those exams could ever be used as an admission standard to get into college. We believe they were a waste of time and effort, and thankfully the Speaker Hickman had legislation to roll that back, and in a bipartisan effort, after several years of really hammering on that issue, House Republicans and Democrats came together to advance the cause and roll back many of those EOI exams. And then the two other issues that I want to address as highlights were these, and they pertain specifically to public education and the people's influence over their elected officials. For the last several weeks, we have been inundated with hundreds and hundreds of phone calls and emails calling for two things: calling for an end to voucher programs, saying vote against vouchers that Representative Nelson and Senator Clark Jolly offered up, and as well as tap the rainy day fund to help our public schools this year. And because of the pressure that was applied by Oklahoma citizens, we are proud to say that when the deadline ended this week, both voucher bills in the House and Senate were not heard, and they weren't heard for a reason. That's because every Democrat in the House and every Democrat in the Senate, along with a good number of Senate Republicans and House Republicans, had heard from their constituents and had refused to support those vouchers, which would have taken money away from our public school children and sent it to private schools. And because of that, vouchers, it looks like the voucher concept is dead for this legislative session, and we owe it all to the people of Oklahoma, the parents and the teachers and the principals and the administrators. And just in that same vein, because of their efforts, this week the House and Senate and the governor decided that it was time to tap the rainy day fund for public education to the tune of $51 million to try to help alleviate some of these cuts that were born because of the revenue failures that began in January of this year. And so there were some real highlights coming out of this week for our public school students. A couple of the lowlights, and then I'll be glad to answer any questions. I will say this: my caucus was frustrated by the fact that we spent hours upon hours during a deadline week dealing with issues that were very, very controversial, that at the end of the day probably won't become law. Even if they do, they serve more for a political campaign speech or a political campaign mail piece than they do about really affecting the lives of everyday citizens. Lots of different social issues and hot button issues that may sound good on the floor of the House of Representatives, but at the end of the day do very little to do anything about closing a $1.3 billion budget hole or anything at all about improving education, healthcare, public safety, or transportation in Oklahoma. And so that was really disappointing to see that was considered a priority this week. And then finally, we're done with the first 6 weeks, and there's not been one bill on the floor of the House of Representatives that we believe will do anything to close the $1.3 billion budget hole. They offered up a few weeks ago a measure to take 110,000 people off of Medicaid to try to save some money, but they know full well that requires federal approval, and the federal government will never grant them that authority. And so there's no cost savings there. And even if they were to realize the $100 million worth of cost savings, we believe it would do more to hurt the budget because of the $200 million worth of federal money that would be lost. And then secondly, they've offered up no real solutions. They may say that the internet, by raising taxes or requiring people to pay taxes on the internet, is going to be a budget solution for them. The problem there is, as they well know, while I think that it is time to find a solution that will help Main Street businesses in Oklahoma, the fact of the matter is that solution resides in Washington. Senator Langford and others have said, and they understand, that as long as federal law states that a business like Amazon does not have to remit sales taxes unless they have a brick and mortar store in the state, as long as that law exists in that manner, no law that we passed out this week will do anything to force online retailers like Amazon to remit sales taxes. And so while Amazon should have to remit those sales taxes, unfortunately, what measures they offered up this week will not accomplish that particular goal, and therefore we have finished the first 6 weeks of session, and there's not one bill that's been passed off the House floor that will add one new dollar to closing this budget hole. There's discussions now about robbing transportation dollars and from the 8-year plan to fund transportation infrastructure improvements in the state, and taking those and putting those in essentially as one-time money to fill the budget hole, and taking out a bond, a $900 million or $1 billion, close to $1 billion bond proposal. That'll be a big fight, because we fundamentally believe that just like you can't cut your way to prosperity, as the Republicans have tried to do by cutting income taxes and cutting taxes on oil and gas industry and all the $1 billion worth of tax credits, you can't cut your way to prosperity, nor can you borrow your way out of debt. And so I think there will be a big fight that will revolve around the Republican majority's efforts to bond their way out of this debt. If they take it this one time, next year, that money's going to have to go back in to pay down those bonds and to fund transportation infrastructure improvements. So therefore, it really is just another one-time gimmick to solve a long-term problem. What we've said is we understand that because of the fiscal irresponsibility of the majority party over the last 6 or 7 years, there's going to be significant budget cuts. But our point is there shouldn't have to be budget cuts 3 years from now. But if we don't get a proper tax structure created and fix the problems such as the gross production tax, the income tax, and tax credits, well, you could do one-time fixes all you want, but next year there'll be more budget cuts requiring more one-time fixes and 2 or 3 years down the road. So our perspective is this: we need to look at it from not just this year, but 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the road, which unfortunately most of our legislators, especially those in the majority, they're only looking to the next election. We know the budget cuts are going to have to come. The fiscally irresponsible decisions made over the last 6 years are going to require budget cuts. There's virtually no way around it. From our perspective, you need to use the rainy day money, you need to look at income tax money, you need to look at sales taxes and exemptions, tax credits and exemptions as a way to partially fill the hole. The rest are going to have to be made up with budget cuts. But if we make the right decisions on income taxes, tax credits and exemptions, and the gross production tax, when the price of oil does go back up in the near future, then our tax structure will be sufficient such that we don't have to make those cuts in the future. There's not a $1.3 billion wand you can wave and fix this problem. We could have avoided the problem a few years ago if the Republican majority would have listened to our calls to be more fiscally responsible. They didn't, and because of that, the people of Oklahoma are going to suffer. The fact of the matter is they don't have to suffer 3 years from now if we make the right decisions when it comes to our tax structure today. If we fix the mistakes that they made over the last 6 years, we don't have to have cuts 3 years from now.